Thank you very much. Okay, let's continue where we started last week. We're in the middle of the story of Yaakov receiving the blessings from his father Yitzchak, which is the 27th chapter of Bereshit. At this point, Yaakov has, at the insistence of his mother, brought the food to his father Yitzchak and is pretending to be Esav. Yisrael becomes suspicious, but Yaakov somehow was able to, because he's dressed like Esav, etc., he's able to trick his father and to receive the blessing that Yitzchak had intended to give to Esav. That's as far as we got last week. We'll revisit some of the core questions around the story. But if we start here in the middle of chapter 27, which is chapter 27 in the 30th pasuk, you have that text with you. Yes, we can post it on Sefaria for those that don't have it. Chumash. It's chapter 27, verse number 30. It says, "Vahi kasher kila Yitzchak levarech et Yaakov, vahiach yotzo Yaakov miyeknei Yitzchak aviv, v'yesav achiv ba mitzeido." So just as Yaakov has left Yitzchak, Yitzchak has finished blessing Yaakov. Just as Yaakov's leaving, that Yotzo Yaakov, and here's Esav achiv ba mitzeido. Esav comes in right after Yaakov leaves, and that reminds us of the tension in the story, among other things, that not only does Yaakov have to get a blessing, but he has to get the blessing before Esav returns, which is another complication in the story. In any event, that's what happens, and now Esav has brought his game, which Yitzchak had instructed him, go to the field, prepare the food for me, and I will bless you. And here's Esav coming in, not knowing that Yaakov has already received the blessing. I'll get to the core questions in a couple of minutes. Read a few verses. It's Vayas kavu matamim, vayovelu yaviv, vayomu yaviv, yokum aviv, v'yochal mitzeid beno, v'avur tvorchani nafshecha. So Esav says to his father, yokum avi, my father should stand and bless and eat of the game of his son, in order that you bless me. And in other words, Esav talks in a way more respectfully to Yitzchak than Yaakov does, because Yokum Avi is third person. Father should sit up. So he talks very respectfully to his father. He's done exactly what his father has told him to do. So Yitzchak says to him, Yitzchak, his father, says, who are you? That is to say, he's assuming up to this point that the one who came before was Esav. So now the question is, who are you? Because Esav already came. So who are you? Vayomer ani bincha b'charchai Esav. I am your son, your eldest son, Esav. Notice, and I mentioned this last week, that when Esav says to his father, I'm Esav, the Torah uses the word ani. When Yaakov is asked, who are you? He says, Anochi Esav b'chorecha. The Anochi is the emphatic, I am Esav, suggesting there might be some doubt as to who he actually is. So Yaakov is perhaps uncomfortable, well, he's certainly uncomfortable in the situation in which he finds himself. But Esav says, I'm Esav, just as you said. Ani Esav, ani bincha b'cha Esav. And now we have Yitzchak's response. Vayecharad Yitzchak charada b'dava ad ma'od. So Yitzchak, Vayecharad, I would translate as trembled. Here they translate, Isaac was seized with a violent trembling. I think that's an accurate translation. And that Yitzchak says, if so, mi efo hu atzod zayit, vayoveli v'ochal mikol, v'terem tavo v'avocheu, gam baruch yiyeh. So Isaac is trembling with a violent trembling. Who is it then that hunted game and brought it to me. I ate of it before you came, and I blessed him. And here they say, now he must remain blessed. I think that's actually questionable translation. Now he must remain blessed. There are two ways to go with this, I think. The Ramban already, why would he say, in fact, he's blessed? I mean, if he's trying to see that Esau is very bothered by this, but it means one of two things. Either it means, who's the one who came to me and succeeded in me having blessed him? In other words, it's not necessarily an affirmation of the blessing, but he's saying, if you are Esau, then who came before? Who came and did exactly as I told you to do? And in fact, I did bless him. That's one way to go. Similar to he must remain blessed, but less of an emphasis on that. But the other way, and this is actually a very important point, the Ramban says, maybe it means something else. Gam Baruch Yiyeh could mean, and in fact, he received the blessing. That is to say, that if I blessed him, he in fact remains blessed. In other words, the blessing is taking effect. It's a very fundamental question. If the blessing was given under false pretenses, then why is the blessing a valid blessing? That's a good question. But what Yitzchak seems to be affirming over here, however we understand it, is that in fact, I blessed him. And since I blessed him, it's not a blessing I can take back. We'll come back to this point later. So those are two possibilities. But in fact, he's blessed, and it's a fait accompli. So who was that person? So when Kishmoa Esav, Kishmoa Esav at the Vrei Aviv, Vayitzak Tzaka Gedola Umara Anod. When Esav heard what his father said, he cried out with a great and bitter cry. Notice that the responses of Esav and Yitzchak are described in similar fashion. They are very extreme responses. The Torah uses in each case the same term ad ma'od. In the case of Yitzchak, it's a trembling. Some translate as a bewilderment, but the term the Torah uses is vayecharad. Charadah, generally speaking, means fear. That's his response. Esav has a different response, a bitter cry. Tzaka gedala umara anod. Vayomer li aviv, baracheni gam ani avi. He said to his father, "Father, bless me also." So Esav, the blessing of his father is very important. He's deeply connected to his father, as we saw, says he naming in the first verse. And somehow someone has supplanted him. Father is suggesting maybe he's lost his blessing. So he says, okay, bless me as well. Bless me as well. Whoever came first. And now we have Isaac's response.
Rabbi?
Yes.
May I just ask one question? In both the case with Jacob and with Esau, the first thing that's mentioned is the food and then the blessing. I ate and then I blessed him here. And then with Esau, before you came, the hunted game and brought it to me, and then the blessing. Why is this meal it's mentioned before the blessing? Why is that coming first?
So I discussed last week two possibilities, which are not mutually exclusive, about the significance of the food, the meal. One of them had to do with the fact that for the food, which is essentially go out to the field and bring back sort of blessing from the field, which is what Esav does. That is for Yitzchak something very significant. In fact, when he smells the garment of Esav, which Yaakov was wearing, he says, he says that I smelled the field. For Yitzchak, more than anybody else, there's a connection to the actual field. That's what Yitzchak does. He goes out to the field, he plants. Yitzchak, he reaps 100-fold in the field. He digs wells. So the very earth itself for Yitzchak is a connection to the earth that nobody else has in Sefer Bereshit, but Yitzchak has that connection to the actual earth. So the blessing should take effect. He wants the blessing to the things you bring from the field reinforce in his mind what the blessing is all about.
So
That
it's
was
the
one
connection
path.
to the land then?
Yeah, the actual physical land, which is the source of blessing. That was one path.
Thank you.
The second path, I mentioned what Devorah had written about many years ago, that the food over here in chapter 27, which is the transfer story from Yitzchak to one of his sons, and of course is deeply connected to the first transfer story of the Akedah, the transfer of the blessing from to Avram and then to Yitzchak, giving of the blessing to Yitzchak, right? That in each of those two cases, in the first instance, what makes that possible is the sacrifice. And in this case, the food, the game that is hunted, it's not an actual sacrifice, but it has a sacrificial cast to it. Now, why you need the sacrifice in order to transfer the blessing? So I mentioned her suggestion that it's a way to deflect the violence, because in transferring the blessing from it, in the case of the Torah, father to son, there's an inherent violence because, in fact, the son displaces the father. Once it transfers to the son, you don't need the father anymore. So there's a tension between father and son when it comes to the blessing. And one way to deal with the tension is to have some kind of scapegoat, some object upon which the violence is deflected. That was her suggestion, and she tries to play that out in Sefer Bereshit. It's a very interesting idea. So those are two possibilities, but it is, you call our attention to the fact that yes, there's a tremendous emphasis here on the food, on the game, on the animals that are, right? Because the animals that Jacob brings to his mother Rivka, the two goats which he's going to prepare. So she's going to slaughter the goats and prepare the food. So the food is the medium of blessing is actually the food. The food is necessary for the blessing to be transferred, in this case, from the father to the son. So Esav is extremely upset. He cries with a great and bitter cry. And now Yitzchak responds. Vayomer bo achicha b'mirma vayikach birchatecha. So Isaac says to Esav, your brother came b'mirma. They translate with guile. I would say with deception, and took your blessing. Rashi, of course, the defense attorney of Yaakov in the story, and the prosecuting attorney of Esav, cites the Targum, the mirma, says Rashi, b'chochma, with wisdom. And it is true that perhaps in the book of Proverbs, the word mirma sometimes can have a positive cast to it. But it's not true that in the Torah, mirma has a positive cast to it. It's a very negative word. It means deception, and it's a big negative. So Yitzchak doesn't mince any words. Your brother came in deceit and took your blessing, which is a way of saying, I've already given away your blessing. He says, bless me too, Father. Your blessing has been given away. Yes, it was taken with deceit. On the other hand, Yitzchak says, but the blessing was a valid blessing. The blessing took effect. We'll get back to that question and the nature of the blessing very soon. And now Esav comments, Vayomer hachi kara shemo Yaakov. So he says, is that the reason he was called Jacob? He was named Jacob, Yaakov. Vayakoveni ze pamayim. He has Vayakoveni, I would say he had circumvented me twice. A cove is something which is not straight. For Yohe al cove, the crooked shall become straight, or the circuitous shall become straight. He circumvented me twice. Supplanted me, it translates, supplanted me twice. It's also a possibility. And b'chorati lokach, he took my birthright. V'hinei ata lokach birchati, and now he took my blessing. Vayomar haro atzalta li bracha. Have you not reserved a blessing for me? Now let's just think about this verse for a moment. We'll come back to all the bigger questions, but the point is, he says he did two things. He took my birthright, and now he took the blessing. Now, when it comes to the birthright, did he actually take the birthright from Esau? Well, in chapter 25, Esau comes back from the field and he's tired. Vayazid Yaakov Nazir, back in chapter 25. Let's find that verse for a second. 25, verse number, beginning in verse number 29. Vayazid Yaakov Nazir. Chapter 25, verse 20, verse 20, 29 or 28, I can't see. 29, verse 29 says that, chapter 25, verse 29, yes, we scroll back to that. It says that Yaakov prepared, Vayazid Yaakov Nazir, the zidim or lentils. Vayazid is the verbal form. He lentils. We see cooked lentils. And Esav came back from the field. He was tired. And Esav says to Yaakov, "Hariteni na min ha'adam hazeh ki ayef anochi." It says, pour down. Hariteni means stuff down that red stuff, for I am tired. So he's requesting the food. He puts it in an inelegant fashion, hariteni na, and therefore he's called Edom. And Yaakov says to Esav, "Michrach hayom et bechoratcha, sell me your birthright." Vayomer Esav, and Esav said, "Hinei anochi olech lamut, I'm going to die," which could mean I'm going to die of hunger now, or it could mean I'm a mortal being. I'm going to die in the future. Who cares about birthrights? I care about the food, not about what happens in the future. I live for the moment. I need the food now. Vayomer Yaakov hishavali kayom. Swear, says Yaakov. Swear. Vayishavalo, and Esav swore. Vayimkor b'chorato Yaakov. So he sold the birthright to Jacob. And then it says Yaakov gave Esav bread and lentils. Vayochel, vayesh, vayokam, vayelach. He ate, drank, got up and left. Vayivez Esav b'tabachora. So Esav spurned or squandered the birthright. So now Esav says, he circumvented me twice. He took my birthright, and now he took my blessing. But did he actually take the birthright? It sounds like a legitimate sale. It sounds like a legitimate sale. In fact, not only a legitimate sale in terms of he sold it to him, but it also says that he swore. We know that when you take an oath in the Bible, that's it. There's no way to retract that. So what does it mean to say? And in point of fact, one could make the argument that when Esav approaches his father, Anochi Esav b'chorecha, there is some justification in the sense he is the firstborn. After all, Esav was summoned because he's Beno HaGadol, the bigger one, perhaps the older one. But in point of fact, that privilege has been transferred to Yaakov. So the Torah raises this as a possibility, not to fully justify necessarily what Yaakov does, but it's another factor in the story. On the other hand, as we studied, Vayazid Yaakov Nazid, which plays on the Hebrew word mezid, which means intention. In other words, it's not an accident that he happens to be preparing supper when Esav comes from the field. It's not a shogeg, it's a mezid. It's intentional. He knows exactly when Esav comes back. He knows exactly that Esav will be tired. He knows the personality of Esav. He knows that Esav will give up the future for the present. So yes, it is legitimate. It's, it's a valid sale. On the other hand, it's devious. And he tricks might be the wrong word, but he takes advantage of Esau's vulnerabilities. What's interesting about that little vignette is that in that little vignette of the sale of the birthright, there's so much there. Because on one hand, Yaakov acts, one could say, in a very deceptive way, taking advantage of the other person's weaknesses. to secure this birthright, and the reader doesn't know yet what the value of this birthright is. But when you reach our chapter 27, one gets the impression that Yaakov having the birthright is a way to justify him taking the blessing, which is what Esav seems to say. He circumvented me twice. In other words, now I understand his desire to get the birthright. The desire to get the birthright was to set up the blessing, which is certainly deceptive. So in other words, the first thing leads to the second. Perhaps that's what Esav is saying. On the other hand, the description of Esav in those few verses is very striking. Apart from the fact that the Torah says, Vayivez Esav et Bechorah, Vayivez, he spurned, he thought lightly of, he didn't care about the birthright. Vayivez is always a negative word. But apart from that, the very description of Esav, the way he talks, how he taini nam in hadom azeh, pour that red stuff down my gullet. There's something very crude about Esav. He is a hunter, which from the standpoint of the Chumash is a negative. So the description of Esav is negative. It adds a lot of color to the story. There's nobody, it's not a matter of one is pure and one is evil. There's no evil and there's no pure. There's complications on all sides. It's the beauty of the story. So in any event, what Esav says is, that's why they called him Yaakov. So there's, and Isaac has already said, your brother came to Mirmah, which is certainly a negative, Rashi notwithstanding. Your brother came with guile, with deceit, took your blessing, and there's little I can do. It reminds us of chapter 25 in the sense there too, there's a sale and there's an oath. So it's a final sale. You can't get anything, you can't change that. But Esav perhaps is suggesting the reason for Yaakov's interest in the birthright is he's setting up the possibility of other benefits, one of which we read about in chapter 27. So Esav says to his father, don't you have a blessing for me? Hello, atzalta, from the word etzel. Isn't there something left to give me? And Yitzchak responds and says to Esav, Vayan Yitzchak vayomer li Esav, back to chapter 27, in verse 37, Hein gevir samtiv lach, I made him your superior, your master, your gevir. V'yet kol echav notati lo lavadim, and I made all his brothers. He only has one brother, but it probably, sometimes the word ach means the family members. I made him the chief of the family. The others are his servants. And I sustained him with grain and with wine. And for you, therefore, what can I do for you, my son? One gets the sense over here. Esav, Yitzchak loves Esav. That's clear. He loves Esav. But he's what can I do? He says. He's trying to figure out a way to help Esav out, but he can't figure out the way because I've already given away your blessing. My son, he says, what can I do for you? And Esav's response, Vayomer Esav el aviv habracha achat yilucha aviv. Father, do you have only one blessing? Borcheni gam ani aviv. Bless me also, Father. Vayisa Esav kolo vayev. And Esav raised his voice. He cried out loud. And now Yitzchak will find a way to give Esav a blessing. Before I'll stop in a moment to take some comments and get to what the core question that I want to deal with, one of the core questions I want to deal with. Let me make a different point about the story, though. And that is, what's very important when we study any story, certainly true of the Chumash, is the position of the one telling the story. There's somebody telling us the story, what they like to call today the implied author. What is the attitude of the storyteller over here? And it strikes me that when you read this story, minus the apologetics, there's a history of apologetics around the story. When you read the story, it strikes me that the narrator, called the Torah, goes out of its way to present Esav in a very sympathetic light. Yes, he does foolish things. Yes, he does, but for the moment, But there's something about the story over here about Esav and Yitzchak also. These are two people in a lot of pain because there's a deep connection between them. And Yitzchak is trying to find some way to help his son. And the description of Esav and his bitter cries and his critique of Yaakov, which is certainly on target. And finally, he cries once again, Vayisakolo Vayev. The reader can't help, I think, but be sympathetic to the Esav of chapter 27. And that's a very important point. So that does not necessarily mean that the blessing should not be given to Yaakov. That's a separate question. And it might depend what blessing we're talking about, which we'll get to in a minute. But we have to always look at the sympathy of the narrator. And strikes me the sympathy of the narrator is in this case with Esav. It's very interesting to note, and the reason the story is so important, of course, is this probably is this is the significant story which sets the trajectory for Yaakov's entire life. His entire life, you can see in this story over here. He's going to be forced to run away. He's going to build a family in a way that reminds us very much of the conflict with his own brother and the conflicts within Yaakov's own family, constantly recalling the story of Yaakov and Esav, etc. This is a foundational story, and it also foundational in the sense that it sets up Esav or reinforces the idea that Esav and Yaakov will be eternal enemies on some level. And the main character in the Bible, that is Israel's primary enemy, also God's primary enemy, is of course Amalek. And the Amalek story comes out of the story of Yaakov and Esav. I'll come back to that later, but I'll make one simple point. And in the Megillah, for example, when the decree against the Jews has been publicized at the instigation of the Agagite, Haman, the Amalekite, Amalek being Esav's grandson. And Mordechai goes in chapter 4, in the great chapter of the Megillah, and he cries out with a great and bitter cry. The only other time we find that expression is right here in our chapter. So you have one might say, a retelling of the story of Yaakov and Esav, Haman being Esav's descendant, and Mordechai HaYehudi. So this story is constantly being played off and played out in a whole variety of ways. Now, before I stop for a moment to take comments or questions, what we'll do after the comments and questions is deal with last week. So Tova raised several important points at the end of last week. I said I'd deal with it this week. And I want to get to the central question, which is exactly what Yitzchak was thinking and the nature of the blessing that Yitzchak has conferred upon Yaakov and is about to confer upon Esav in a sense as well. And what is the nature of that blessing? That's a very central question. It touches on the question of, was Yitzchak simply mistaken? Does Yitzchak have something else in mind? And the mistake is more on the part of Rivka. So I'll get to that question shortly. Before I get there, does anybody have any comments or questions at this point?
Can I ask a question, please?
Yes, of course.
Can you explain the whole concept of Bechorah? What is it? What is it altogether?
Concept of what?
Bechorah.
That's a good question. So
Bechorah.
Yes, Bechorah.
What is
so
it?
The point
what
is
it? For
right.
God's sake, so to speak.
Well, I would say within the Tanakh there are 2 points. First of all, the Bechor in the book of Devarim gets an additional portion, not just in the book of Devarim, by the way, but even in the book of Breshit, because at the end of the day, in the case, for example, of Yaakov, who has 12 sons, but one of the sons is the Bechor, and that son should get an additional benefit. The oldest son is Reuven, but when Yaakov blesses his children, the first, Reuven is the oldest, Reuven Bechoriata, you're the Bechor, right? Yeter Se'et v'yeter Az. Pachas kamayim al totar. You don't get the extra. You're too quick you're too thoughtless, al totar. You don't get the extra portion. So who does get the extra portion? Of Yaakov's 12 sons, who gets the extra portion? It's not Reuven, the eldest of Leah. So the one that gets the extra portion is Yosef, the eldest of Rachel. How does Joseph get the extra portion? Answer, there are two tribes.
I am Menashe.
Ephraim and Menashe. So Joseph gets two portions, which is how they understand, right? Pishtayim. That's how the rabbinic tradition understood the psukim in Devarim, and it accords well with Sefer Bereshit. You get, if there are four brothers, let's say, one is the firstborn, it's divided into 5 pieces. The firstborn gets 2 and the others get 1. That's what you have. So point number 1 is that the Bechor, it would appear in the classical text of the Torah, has some financial benefit, is accorded some financial benefit. Then we know that in terms of things like succession, kingship, for example, kingship typically goes to the oldest son. If there's more than one, barring some, in the case of David, for example, Amnon would have been the successor to David, and he gets killed by his rival. But the point is that that's another point. Then we have the Bechor in the land of Egypt, right? Makat Bechorot. That somehow the Bechor initially, before they're supplanted by the Leviim, the Bechor has certain privileges when it comes to perhaps ritual matters. Given the fact that the Leviim take the place of the Bechor, looking backwards at it, we should say to ourselves, whatever the Leviim presently do in the Torah, the Bechor once did. So one way to figure out what the privilege of the Bechor would be in the area of ritual, etc., was to look at the Leviim, Shevet Levi, or maybe the Kahuna is part of it as well. Cohen is also a Levi. Looking backwards at it, and that the rabbinic tradition does, it says probably the initial things the Kohanim did before there were Kohanim, the Bechor did. So those are 3 areas in which the Bechor has some primacy. But in our story, in any event, it seems to be significant about the Torah emphasizes, yes, Yitzchak does love Esav, and we talked about that. But part of what factors in the story, and the Torah makes this clear, Vayikra et Esav b'no hagadol. He's the older one, the bigger one. Yes, they're born about 3 minutes apart, but in the story he's called b'no hagadol. He's technically the firstborn, and Yaakov seems to accept it on some level, perhaps, because he purchases the birthright. He understands that minimally from Esav's perspective, Esav is the Bechor. Whatever Yaakov really thinks, because they're struggling at birth. Yaakov was trying to hold him back, one might say. Yaakov was trying to emerge first. So that struggle which takes place as they're being born is one that continues afterwards. But apparently it is important for Yaakov to purchase that birthright, to give him certain privileges, and the story in which it plays out, and the only story in which it plays out, is our chapter 27, where Esav describes himself. Ani bincha b'charcha Esav, I'm the Bechor, which would means, of course I'm here to get the blessing, I'm the Bechor. But the Torah raises the question, without resolving it, is that really the case? Because after all, you sold your rights. So that's another example of my point over here, apart from trying to understand details of the story. What's really, I think, very important is to appreciate the complexity of the story. Now, when you deal with law, typically it's not that complicated. You have a chicken, there are 2 possibilities. It's kosher or it's not kosher. There's no half kosher. Chickens are kosher or not kosher. Human beings, there are 500 possibilities. Nobody's kosher. And few people are not kosher either. We're all somewhere in between. It's very complicated. He have a story with so many different pieces to it. There's the fact that Rebecca got the oracle. There's the fact that the oracle itself is somewhat ambiguous. There's the question, who was the firstborn? There's the question, which of these 2 children is should be the natural recipient of the blessing? Which, of course, the real question is, what is the blessing? And I'll come to that question that was raised last week very soon. Yes, Susie, you want to say something?
Yes, please. Isn't it possible that Rivka really misjudged how much Yitzchak, how well Yitzchak knows his children? Because he loves Esav, but thinking when it was really Yaakov, he gives him the bracha of power and wealth, but he doesn't give him the covenantal blessing, what you call it. He doesn't give him
That we'll talk about. That's what I want to speak about. That was Tony's question last week. Now, second person, Susie has the same question. Yeah, it's certainly a possibility. I'll try to lay out the two possibilities in reading the story.
I have a
Yes,
comment.
I will do that. It's that's the central question in the story. I'll get to that question momentarily. Yes, Aviva.
Yes, my comment is not about the central question, but about Yaakov, Ekev, and deception.
Yes,
And
what about
I just noticed three places where Yaakov is, so that Esau in line 36 says, Hu Yaakveni.
That's right.
And then in 25, V'yado ochezet ba'akev.
Yes.
And in Breshit Gimel 15, when God curses the snake, he says, Ata teshufenu akev.
Yes.
So it's the word akev,
Yes.
that is the name of Yaakov, is connected with deception and with the snake. So that is my observation.
Yes. So I have spoken about that many times, but there's more to say about that. There's more to say about that, because the point is that, again, there's no apologetics here. The snake bites you with the akev, and you have to understand, what is the akev? I mean, you have it with the Greeks, Achilles heel. The akev is the point of weakness. That's how the snake operates. The snake looks for vulnerabilities and attacks you at the weakest point, takes advantage of weakness. And the people that do that in the Bible are called Amalek. That's what Amalek always does. They come and attack you at the weakest point, and make different kinds of weakness. There could be physical weakness, as the Torah describes in Devarim. They attack the stragglers. It could be a spiritual weakness. We first encounter Amalek in chapter 17 of Shemot. And the people say in the desert, is God with us or not? Amalek. It could be that Amalek, even if they don't attack you, they expose someone's weakness. That's the story of King Saul. That's the downfall of King Saul, which is brought to the fore by Amalek. That's the story of Megillat Esther with Haman. The Jews, it says, Haman are scattered and dispersed amongst the nations. It means they don't have any nation of their own. Don't have their own state. They're simply scattered and dispersed amongst the nations. And they're an easy target, he says. It's not even worthwhile keeping them alive. They can't defend themselves. They have no central space. They have no central army. They can't defend themselves. So we can kill them. We can kill them. And I forget who it was that one of the Israeli generals, once they asked them the difference between the Jews in Europe and the Jews in Israel. His answer was about 4,000 tanks. That was his answer. I didn't forget that. Be able to defend yourself. That's very important, to be able to defend yourself. And the fact is, that's Amalek. Amalek attacks you at the weakest point, and that's the snake. So you're 100% right. And actually, the Torah is going out of its way, and we'll see this later in spades. The Torah goes out of its way to describe Yaakov as the snake. When you stand in front of a blind person and trick a blind person, there's no better example. There's no more Amalekite behavior possible than tricking someone who can't see. Well, it's indefensible, really. Now, it's defensible in the sense, one might say the ends justify the means, maybe. But in point of fact, that's the point of the story. Even if you believe, and it could be true, that this blessing, as Rivka says, Yaakov, this blessing you have to get. It's an inappropriate phrase of it's right for you, which could well be the pshat, but there's always a price to pay for the way you get it. And the fact is, and this is a very important point, that it's not just about getting a good result, but the way that you get there is very important. That's a critical point in all aspects of life. It's not just the end. How did you get to this point? And the Torah is very concerned about that. And the price Yaakov has to pay for this is extreme. And the larger point, of course, is that for Yaakov to actually return, he has to be transformed. He has to change himself into becoming a different person, which he does. Because Yisrael and Yaakov, as the Ramban very beautifully points out, are actually opposites. Because Yisrael can be read as Yashar El, direct, straight. And Yaakov is Akov L'Mishar. In fact, in the book of Dvarim, as I mentioned many times, I think it's in the Ramban as well, Israel is not called only Yisrael, they're called Yeshurun. And Yeshurun from the word Yashar. Yeshurun is not a new name. Yeshurun is Yisrael. So the point, what the Torah is setting up over here is Yaakov's amazing transformation. Transforms himself, actually. And that's the greatness of Yaakov. But unless you appreciate the Akov and the Nachash and the Akev, you can't appreciate the greatness of Yaakov. You also can't appreciate the Chumash. So this is a story of extreme complexity, and that's what makes it a great story. That's what makes the Chumash so special. You reduce it to just black and white, and what you have is Torah tales or something like that. Yes, is there anything else? Yes,
Rabbi, yes. Sorry, Rabbi Silber, there's just a few questions in the chat that I don't want to get lost in the shuffle. From
we'll take 5 more minutes on questions, and I want to get to the main point that I want to speak about.
Then from Laszlo Marcus, how come Esau is so disturbed now, but earlier he had contempt for the right of the firstborn?
Because the point is, first of all, he doesn't necessarily connect the rights of the firstborn to this particular blessing. He may connect it to other things. Second of all, because when you live in the moment, you're thinking about the moment. He's not thinking about the future. He's thinking he lives it for the moment. The moment is the bowl of soup. Now, the question is, this touches on the question we'll get to in 1 minute, which is, what is the blessing we're talking about? That's the core question in the chapter. And there are 2 ways to understand this chapter. I'm not going to resolve it, but there are 2 different approaches. Yes, who else had a question here? Sandra, yes?
Okay, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. So my question is this. You touched on it, and I presume you're going to touch on it again and again just a few minutes ago, about whether or not if a blessing is given and the recipient wasn't the person you intended to give it to, does the blessing still have legitimacy? And that's right. The whole point of the conversation and the misery between Isaac and Esau. But shouldn't there also be a harking forward and a harking backward to when Lavan ends up, obviously, hoisting Jacob with his own petard and tricking him and switching the brides. And in the morning, it reminds me so much of this scene. In the morning, Jacob says, oh my God, it says, the narrator says, Baboker v'hinei hi Leah. So I always thought to myself, if he married a person whom he thought was one woman, and of course, after the prima nocte, he sees that it was another woman. So the question is the same. I always thought it touched on this. Is the blessing, is the marriage legit anyway? And I'm wondering, and of course it deals with deception and it deals with Jacob, and this is the price he's paying, and it's going to come back and bite him and bite him and bite him again and again. But this is something that's sort of an overlying question that I have too. So if in fact the blessing is or isn't legitimate, does this also touch on what's coming, which is that the marriage should or should not the marriage?
Yeah, we'll have to wait till we get to that story. It's a good question. We'll just have to wait till again, there's a complexity over there, but we'll wait till we get to that. The plan is to get there. We'll see, but we're going to proceed through. But we hope to reserve that. I'll take 1 or 2 more questions and we'll stop. Suri, what do you want to say?
Okay.
Yes, Suri?
I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I think that the choice of the words "Halo Atzalta Li Bracha" is very deliberate and telling, because Atzalta, at least the one other time that I know that it's used, connotes that it can be shared, but on a slightly lower level. So I'm referring to the Eldad and Medad story.
Yes.
where Moshe sails by Yeyatzel min haruach asher alav vayitain al shivim ish hazkenim. So Moshe is able to share his divine connection, his ability, his nevuah ability with the other shivim zkenim without it detracting from his own. But at the same time, we know the Torah says there never was anyone like Moshe. So the other shivim have it, but they have it on a slightly lower level. And the word atzalta here, maybe the narrator is hinting that yes, it will be able to be shared, but it won't be the primary bracha. There will be a bracha for Esav. We don't have to worry.
Let me deal with this right now, this core question, and then we'll take at the end more questions if there's time. There are two basic approaches to reading the story over here. One approach is that, let me start with the one approach I did not raise last week. Here's the following possibility. Namely, that what Yitzchak intends, the blessing Yitzchak intends to give to one of his sons, to Esau, is not what we call the blessing of Abraham. It's a different blessing. The blessing of Abraham is about the land. It's a spiritual blessing. It's about the land of your sojourning. It's about this special place. It's about having a connection to God and being worthy of it through your moral behavior. That's not what Yitzchak has in mind. There are two different blessings. The blessing over here is simply this wouldn't be my formulation of it, but a material blessing. Tala shamayim mishmani haaretz. And that blessing, Yitzchak intends to give to Esau. Yitzchak does not intend to give to Esau the other blessing, which we would just call the blessing of Abraham. And Rebecca, according to this interpretation, Rebecca misunderstands this. Rivka thinks that Yitzchak intends to give Esau Abraham's blessing, a blessing for which Esau is inappropriate, having married two Canaanite women. We are told that at the end of the previous chapter. And she misunderstands that. She thinks that Yitzchak has that in mind. In fact, when Yitzchak speaks to Esau, he says, I will bless you before I die. But when Rivka repeats what Yitzchak said, she says, I will bless you before God before I die. So that's one way to understand it, that he's not making a mistake. He understands his children. Esau is the Ish Sadeh. Esau he loves him. He's also the older one. Thinks it's an appropriate blessing for Esau. And Rivka made the mistake. That's an approach one could take. And in point of fact, when you get to the next chapter, chapter 28, after Rivka intervenes, we'll hopefully get there next week if we don't get there this week, and Yitzchak calls in Yaakov in the beginning of chapter 28. He says, after Rivka says at the end of 27, I can't take these Canaanite women. If Yaakov will marry Canaanite women, why do I live? Then Yitzchak calls in Yaakov, Vayivarech until he gives him a bracha. And Vayitzaveu, he commands him, the language of mitzvah, the language of bracha. Says, Lo tikach isha mibnot Canaan, you are forbidden to marry a Canaanite woman. Kumrech padena aram, beit betuel avi imecha, v'kachocha misha mibnot lavan achi imecha. And then he continues, it does Yitzchak, Biel Shaddai Yivarech Otcha V'Yafrecha V'Yirbecha V'Yito L'Kal Amim V'Yitenu Cha B'Rikat Avraham L'Cha U'Zarecha Itach. So when Yitzchak speaks to Yaakov in chapter 28, and all the language he uses is language drawn directly from what God said to Abraham in chapter 17. Kahal Amim, El Shaddai is the language of beginning of 17, where God tells Abraham, I'm going to bless you with the blessing of Abraham, blessing of the land, blessing between me and you. And it's called Birkat Abraham. So one new line of thought is that, this is a line of thought. Yitzchak did not make a mistake. Yitzchak was going to give Esau the other blessing, the blessing of Tala Shemayim Shmani Haaretz, but reserved, he wasn't going to give Esau the blessing of Birkat Abraham. We don't know what he had in mind for Birkat Abraham, but it wasn't going to go to Esau. That's a way to read the story. And when Esau says to Yaakov, to his father, do you have only one blessing, right? don't you have another blessing? And it sounds like he doesn't have another blessing. But what that would mean, according to this interpretation, is I may have another blessing, but it's not relevant to you. As far as you're concerned, there is one blessing. This is fundamentally an approach that one can take in reading the story. That's a possibility. That's not the approach I suggested last week, but it's certainly a possibility. We have to keep that in mind, okay? That's an approach. That's what Tova was raising last week. Maybe he did make a mistake. He knows Esav. He's connected to Esav. He loves Esav. Well, that's true. So this is one way to read the story. Two separate blessings, and the mistake would be then Rivka's error. Rivka made a mistake in terms of how she understands Yitzchak, what she thinks Yitzchak might do. That's on one possibility. On the other side, the other possibility, which I mentioned last week, is different. And the other possibility is that, no, Rivka's not wrong in terms of who should get the blessing. She, as far as Yitzchak is concerned, is one blessing. He knows he has a blessing and he wants to bless his child, namely Esav, the older one. The problem is that Yitzchak himself doesn't understand the very blessing that he has. He wants to bless, but he's not fully aware of the nature of the blessing. And what led us in this direction was, I had mentioned Laura's point about the language of the blessing. Now, the language of the Akedah, the command to Abraham at the Akedah was Kach V'lech, and that Rivka uses that language. When she speaks to Yaakov, Kach and Lech, Yitzchak does not. So the fact that he uses different language could suggest to us he doesn't actually fully comprehend the blessing that he has. In addition to that, we have to remember that in the story, Yitzchak has to be reminded about the Canaanite women by Rivka. At the very end of chapter 27, Rivka goes to Yitzchak in the last verse of chapter 27. Take a look at the last verse of chapter 27. God Tomer Rivka el Yitzchak Kasti b'chayai b'nei benot chet. Says, I'm disgusted with my life because of the Hittite women. Those are the ones that Esav married. Im lokeach Yaakov isha mibnot chet ka'ela mibnot haaretz lama li chayim. If Yaakov will marry Canaanite women, Hittites or Canaanites, why do I live? What's the point? Her point being, she sees herself as one who is there to allow Abraham's covenant to pass to the next generation. But if he'll marry the Canaanite women, so there'll be Canaanites on all sides. So the blessing won't be able to take effect. And then Yitzchak, only when Rivka intervenes, then he calls in Yaakov and he blesses, Vayevarech, and then he gives the blessing. Here he fully knows it's Yaakov. It's not a question, who is he? Here he knows it's Yaakov. And here he talks about the blessing of Abraham. And here he uses all the language of the blessing of Abraham. So this is a different approach. This approach suggests there's only one blessing. And that, in fact, Yitzchak initially misunderstands the blessing. And yet Yitzchak reformulates the blessing in chapter 28. But there's one blessing that he has. His blessing is the blessing given to him by his father Abraham. Those are two different ways to read the story. You can choose which one you wish, obviously. But the point of the Kach V'lech is interesting because, now, one could say that the Kach V'lech is present only in chapter 28, because only in chapter 28 is he actually recalling Abraham's blessing. That's certainly a possible way to read it. But in point of fact, this distinction between these two blessings, what sometimes they call the material blessing, and sometimes they call the spiritual blessing, I wonder about that in general, whether that distinction is really a distinction that Torah draws between spiritual blessings and material blessings. I doubt very much that Yitzchak sees the blessing of the land as a so-called material blessing. That's not the way he talks. God has blessed. For Yitzchak, God's blessing is through the land. His whole life is about connecting to God through the land. And Vayevarcheu Hashem, for Yitzchak, the last thing Yitzchak would consider is the possibility there's a spiritual thing, then there's the earth and the land. No, quite the opposite. For Yitzchak, it's the very earth itself, it's the sacred land, even more than the sacred space, the sacred land for Yitzchak. So that distinction of material and spiritual, I don't think is one that Yitzchak Avinu buys into. Quite the opposite. The other piece of the other interpretation about, and we focused on the point about the language of the blessing, is that in any event, however we see it, we remember that in the story over here, we have the Hineni word, which is the way the Akedah begins. In the Akedah, it's God who commands Abraham, and it's Abraham who says Hineni. In the story over here, what's missing in this story over here is Hineni. The one who says Hineni is Esav. Esav is very willing to do anything to secure his father's blessing. Esav loves his father loves him, and he wants to secure that blessing. And when he's summoned by his father, he says Hineni. Yaakov has not said Hineni. Yaakov said quite the opposite. Says to his mother, maybe it's not worth the risk. That's not Hineni thinking. Hineni thinking means I'll do whatever you want, whatever it entails. So that's an important point for the story, and it underscores the significance of the Kaf Kolech. But in general, these are the two approaches. I will say that having to choose between the two of them, one of the things I think about is, in one approach, it's Rebecca made a mistake. In the other approach, she's right. And it strikes me that, yes, Rebecca is manipulative. Yes, she's Laban's sister. Yes, she's deceptive. Yes, she doesn't seem to care so much how you get to the good end as long as you get there. That's all true. But one thing about Rivka is, and this is throughout, she's extraordinarily perceptive. When she's returning home, she sees Isaac in the field. He sees camels. She sees him. His eyes are dim. She sees very clearly. So therefore, I am inclined to the interpretation which suggests that Rebecca does not make a mistake in terms of the appropriate one for the blessing. I see that more, I'm more prone to see Rivka as being correct and Yitzchak not really understanding. But to Yitzchak's credit, when you correct Yitzchak, he understands it. When she says Canaanite women, then the light bulb goes off in his head, Oh, that's right, Canaanite women, blessing of Abraham. Okay, Kach Valech, he says in 28, and El Shaddai, and Kahal Goyim, and Birkat Abraham, and all the language of chapter 17. But this in general, these are two general approaches to reading the story over here. I don't think that one approach is conclusive. I personally lean more towards the approach that Yitzchak did not initially understand the very blessing. He didn't prevent Esav from marrying the Canaanite women. He didn't instruct Esav not to marry the Canaanite women. So for whatever reason, you could say that is a lack of understanding. Or you could say, perhaps, the other approach would say, because Esav's not a candidate to begin with for the covenantal blessing. We don't care what Esav does. We care what Yaakov does. Two ways to read the story. I'm not 100% sure about which is right, but there's only two ways to read it. That's question that was raised last week. That's a fundamental question. Now, let me just get to one last point about the blessings. Someone at what Sandra had said, that basically, actually, Suri, hello, atzalto li bracha. In the word vayotzel, Suri points us to the story in chapter 11 of the book of Bamidbar. And there Moshe is told to bring the leaders of the people to the center of the camp, to the Mishkan. And God says, "V'yotzalti min haruach asher alecha v'samti alehem." I will take the spirit upon you, which is your spirit, and I will place it upon the people that come next to you. Eitzel, the one that comes together with you. The word Eitzel there means also next to Moshe. And it sounds like the 70 of them, Eldad and Meda, don't show up. The others are somehow sharing the prophecy of Moses, sharing Moses' spirituality. Now, over here in the story of Esav and Yaakov, Esav says, "Father, haven't you reserved the blessing for me? Hello, atzalto li bracha." So I wanted to take a look at the blessing that Esav does receive. Then I'll stop for questions. And next week we'll complete with chapter 28. And then we'll move to the story of Vayetze Yaakov. We'll go as far as we can get. The plan for this class is we'll go to Thanksgiving. Then there's going to be a break because I'm giving a series on Shemitah, on the biblical roots of Shemitah. And then in the spring, we continue.
Rabbi Silber?
Let's look at the blessing of Esav back to chapter 27.
Rabbi Silber, just a correction.
Yes.
There is no. This class does not have a break. This class is going through December.
Oh, you're right.
It's your Tuesday class that has a break. Pardon me.
Tuesday class has a break. My mistake. Even better. So we don't have to break. Good. I don't like the breaks. Go straight. Beautiful. Okay. Even better. Thank you for that correction. Okay. Yitzchak says to Esav, verse number 39. Vayan Yitzchak aviv vayomer elav. Hinei mishmanei haaretz yeh moshavecha umital hashamayim me'al. The first thing he says, behold, he says, your abode, your place, will enjoy the fat of the earth and the dew of heaven above. So the blessing that Esav receives, the first pasuk, which Esav gets his blessing, is essentially the same blessing Yaakov got. The blessing Yaakov gets is v'yitu l'cha Elohim mital hashamayim u'mishmanei haaretz v'rov dagan v'tirosh v'yitem l'cha. That's back in verse number 28. And here, in verse 39, it's essentially the same blessing. Something is interesting in the difference between the blessings, and the order is different. It's fundamentally the same blessing. You could talk about a shared blessing. As the Ramban says, there's enough produce to share. There's enough produce in this on planet Earth for everybody to eat well. There's enough, actually. The way human beings have distributed it is problematic, but there is actually enough food for everybody on Earth several times over. That's not the issue. There's enough. But what's interesting is something else which struck me about this blessing, which is talk about sharing. They both can share of God's bounty. Interesting is though, when it comes to Yaakov, v'yitenu l'cha Elohim, that's how it starts. Elohim should give you the following. But when it comes to Esav, there's no v'yitenu l'cha Elohim, but there's something else interesting, which is umital hashamayim me'al. And I wonder about that. From the dew of heaven, me'al, from above. And it strikes that me'al is a reference to God. It's what Avram and Avid Malki Tzedek call God in chapter 14 of his book, El Elyon. That's how we start at Shmona Esrei. El Elyon, the high God. And the Chumash plays with this description of God, of me'al. Because in the next verse begins, verse number 40, V'al charbecha tichyeh. So V'al charbecha tichyeh, and you will live by the sword or through the sword. V'etochicha ta'avod, you will serve your brother. You'll be subservient to your brother. V'yak Hashem tarid, but when tarid, that's a difficult word, to get to that. Uforakta ulo me'al savarecha. You will be able to break the yoke which is around your neck. So we notice that in these two verses, the word al appears 3 times. You have the Tawa Shemayim Me'al, you have Al Charbecha Tichyeh, and you have Uforakta Ulo Me'al Tzavarecha. So there's something about the Al word, which is significant, I would say in contradiction to Elohim. Now, perhaps what he's saying is that you too are under God's, God's watching over you as well. But the God who watches over Esav and the God who watches over Jacob may be 2 different gods, 2 different descriptions of God. One is the El Elyon, which is Malki Tzedek, not a Jew at all. El Elyon is one God, the highest God. And then there's the other God, which is Elohim. It might have it's also a general term, but it might have, in the case of Yitzchak, a more specific reference point. In any event, the first half of the blessing to Esav, one might say, a shared blessing. You and Yaakov basically both have Mishmanei Haaretz. When it comes to the second part, that's interesting. The second part is, yes, I did say that Jacob will be Gvir Echav, will be the master of his brothers, but there is a caveat. kasher tarid, ufarakta ulo miyal tzavarecha. There will be a time, kasher tarid, get to the word tarid in a minute, and then you will be able to break the yoke from your neck. In other words, it's essentially what the oracle said to Rivka. The oracle said to Rivka, La'om mi la'om yamatz. One nation shall be stronger than the other. V'rav yavod sa'ir. The greater shall serve the younger. But on the other hand, he also said, La'om mi la'om yamatz. One shall be greater than the other, without describing which one is greater. And in Yitzchak's blessing, Yitzchak says, you will serve the other, but there will be times there'll be no yoke on you. Because for whatever reason, kasher tarid. Kasher tarid could mean if you suffer too much. Kasher tarid, if you suffer, that's one approach. Kasher tarid could mean when you gain mastery. That's a different approach. There are two different interpretations of the word tarid. And the Rashbam, for example, kasher tarid. It's interesting that Rashi and the Rashbam, it's very telling. They quote the same verse from the Psalms. Arid b'sichi, arid b'sichi. Arid b'sichi, says the Rashbam, lashon tsar, pain. So Rashbam says, if you are in great pain, you will be able to remove the yoke. Rashi, of course, Rashi hates Esau. Rashi comments, when you will be in great pain, says Rashi, if Israel doesn't keep the Torah, then you'll be entitled to feel the pain. That's Rashi. But what's interesting is the Ramban. The Ramban essentially follows the path of the Rashbam, which is kasher tarid, when you suffer. And the Ramban makes a very interesting point about the blessing to Esau. The blessing to Esau, says the Ramban, is, yes, Israel will have dominion over you, provided that Israel doesn't abuse that privilege. But if Israel abuses the privilege, you will seek vengeance from Israel, and you'll be entitled to do so, and you'll be entitled to retribution. And the Ramban gives two examples of that from the Bible, where Israel either did violate this, says the Ramban, or might have violated it. Might have violated it, says the Ramban, is the story in the book of Devarim and Bamidbar, when Israel is trying to get back to the land, and they come to the land of Edom, and they ask permission to pass through Edom. And God says to Israel, Al titgaru bam, don't start trouble with Edom. They have their land, don't start trouble with them. And the Ramban says, don't start trouble with them means you have no right to start trouble with them. You can't just pick a fight with Edom. That's the Ramban. And the Ramban says, it comes back to this verse, kasher tarid. If you mistreat them, you're going to pay the price. And the second example he gives, even a better example, is the story of King David's war against Edom. In the war against Edom, which is mentioned both in the book of Shmuel and Divrei Hayamim and Malachim, it says that after David fought against the Edomites, he left Yoav in the town of the Edomites, and Yoav killed many, many of the men of Edom. That's what it says both in Shmuel and it says in the Sefer Malachim and Divrei Hayamim. And it says that amongst the people, the survivors of the massacre of the Edomites by Yoav, was one fellow, I think it's Hadad. He's the one that escapes to Egypt, and he becomes the adversary of Shlomo HaMelech, and he attempts to unseat and ends up being part of those who destroyed the kingship of Shlomo, actually. And what's interesting is that the Medrash ties that story of the 6 months of the massacre of the Edomites to the fact that for 6 months, because King David reigned for 40 years, but actually if you count it up, he reigned for 40 years and 6 months. That the 6 months are not counted. Somehow he was not really in control for those 6 months. The Ramban actually links all that back to our verse, Vayok Hashem Tarid, so in other words, the point being that actually Yitzchak's response to Esau, don't you have another blessing, Father? Isn't there something reserved for me? And Yitzchak had said, I gave away the blessing. And the way Yitzchak resolves problem that he has is to say, there is only one blessing, but I'm giving you a portion in that blessing, and in two different ways. The first half of the blessing, Tara Shamayim Mishmani Aretz, you also have that blessing, wherever you may live, Moshavecha, inside the land, outside the land, there's the blessing of prosperity. Esav is very prosperous, Esav is very wealthy, actually, powerful. That's one blessing. As far as the second half is concerned, of Avei Gevir Liachecha, your brother will be the Gevir. So that's, okay, that's true, but that has to be qualified. If Israel behaves itself properly within the appropriate, limitations, that's Avei Gevir Liachecha. If they step out of line, however, you will be able to break the yoke. I'll just have one last thought, and I'll stop and take a couple of comments, and that is, Hevei Gevir Liachecha. This was the blessing that Yaakov receives from his father, pretending to be Esav. Right? Standing, I'm Esav, your firstborn. Hevei Gevir Liachecha. The word Gevir is an interesting word, actually, and it appears in a very significant place in the Torah. We'll come back to this later, because it's very important, where we have the word Gimel Bet Resh, Gevir, or Gavar. And that's the war against Amalek. Torah says when Israel was fighting Amalek, Vayavu Amalek, the Torah says when Moses would raise up his hands to heaven, V'gavar Yisrael, Kasher Yaniach Yodo V'gavar Amalek. But when his hands when he put down his hands, Amalek would be winning, V'gavar Amalek. And that picks up on the Gevir, Hevei Gevir Liachecha. That's what the Midrashim are picking up. Yes, you'll be a Gevir if you behave yourself. But if you misbehave, if you're unworthy of the blessing, then the Gevir goes to the other side. Then Ufarato lo mi'al savarecha. Then Esav will be victorious. That's Amalek, Esav's grandson. So that's the Amalek story. We'll get to this later in a much deeper way. The Amalek story is coming out of, among other things, the story of Esav and Yaakov. So let me stop at this point. So what we discussed today was two ways to read the story. I'll leave it up to you to decide which you like better. We got more into the complexity of the story, the nature of the two blessings, the sympathetic picture the Torah gives us of Esav over here. This is a sympathetic picture. We'll continue next week with the blessing that Yitzchak gives Yaakov as he sends him out of the land. Some other details here of Yitzchak and Rivka, and that will set up Yaakov's leaving the land by Yetzer Yaakov. How far we're going to get, I don't know. There's so much here. We can spend a lot of time on it. But I'll take comments or questions now. We have a couple of minutes.
So if I may.
Yes.
So I think the question of the divisibility of the Bechorah is one that's crucial here, but I think it also plays out, and as it plays out with the other Avot as well. So Abraham in particular was very careful to send everyone away and give matanot to the other sons and kept everything for Yitzchak. Yes. Yaakov at the other end divides it up, as you said, but he not only removes it from Reuven and gives it to Yosef, but he gives the dynastic one to Yehudah.
Yes.
And the question of the priestly part, he's rejected Levi, but that he's overruled later. And so this is something that's playing out. And I'd like to see it also when Esav sells the Bechorah. I'd like to say that there's evidence that he is thinking of that Bechorah as the priestly function. And you can read it from the Amalek story, that the pasuk that if you continue, Elohim. So
of course, I'm definitely connected.
And this is midah keneged midah. That
for sure. We'll deal with that at length, right? Let me get back to your first point, though.
Okay, but that's also the point that the selling of the Bechorah there can be seen as the priestly part.
Possible.
Because Esav was not Yirei Elohim, and he didn't care about that, Vayivaz at the Bechorah, but he cared about the other part.
That's a possibility. I mean, I think we have to remember over here in Sefer Breshit is that in terms of Avraham and Yitzchak, the question is, there's only one person selected. In other words, Yaakov's mission, as he sees it, is to build the family that we call the bayit. And that means to build a structure in which everybody has a part. Not all equal parts, but everybody's part of the same family. That's the precursor to the nation. When it comes to the first two avot, Abraham and Yitzchak, only one can be chosen. There is only one that can be chosen over here. There's no sharing. It's either Yitzchak or Yishmael. It's either Yaakov or Esau. That's not to say the others don't have a blessing, but they don't have the covenantal blessing. That's for sure. So that's a very important point, and that will play itself out as far as the second point, that the Amalek story picks up on the Ayefi, Ageya, and all that. That's true in spades, and we'll see more of that as well. That's an incredibly important point. And I would try to give it hopefully an elegant definition of exactly how to understand that. We'll get to that later on. So thank you for those comments, and we'll revisit that for sure.
If you're willing to read it in favor, this story here in favor of Yitzchak rather than Rivka, then you could say that Yitzchak is attempting to make a division of the bracha of the Bechorah.
That's true. You could read
He doesn't succeed. He doesn't succeed, but that was his plan.
Right now, Rivka knows that it can't be shared because that's what the oracle says. The two are in conflict. It can't be shared, actually.
Right.
So Rivka knows something that Yitzchak does not know. Right. And over here, he's trying in some way to have some kind of a sharing arrangement of some sort or other.
Yeah.
That's a good point. But Rivka knows it can't be shared because she's told. Rabbi Avod Sa'ir, Lo Milom Yamat. She's told straight out. The two can't share one blessing. That's not true of Yaakov later. Yaakov's life is about sharing the blessing. Of course, there are problems with sharing the blessing. People have to be able to get along with each other. And one set of brothers tries to kill another. That's not going to work well. I'll pick up this point next week about the sharing of blessings. There's another story we haven't spoken about, which is the backdrop to the story over here, but I'll get to that next week. Okay, I'll take one last comment. Wendy?
Okay. This may be simplistic, but in a certain sense,
I can't hear you when you speak up.
Spends the rest of his life being exiled from the land. He left, personally.
Yes.
Not his descendants, but personally. First, he had to leave because of his mother's fear of Esau. And then at the end of his life, he's driven from the land by famine.
That's true.
And he doesn't he doesn't get to dwell in the land with joy and with wonderful inheritance.
That's true. That's 100% true. That's a very significant point.
Personally.
The story of the Chumash is about being outside the land.
This could be looked at as a punishment for stealing the blessing, although the nationality went with his descendants rather than Esau's.
Okay, we will certainly discuss that. That's a central point of the book, clearly so. And one more, Yael, you want to say something? Yes. You're muted. Speak up. Can't hear. You're muted.
Yael, Ms. Sharon?
You're muted, Yael. Speak up.
Okay, now?
Right. Yes, better.
A very simple observation. If we didn't have all these complications, we wouldn't be reading these books today, these stories today. I mean, you know, the stories are told in a totally, not, Vayelech, Vayakum, Vayelech, Vayeshev, and so on and so forth. But all these complications make it fascinating. I mean, look how many years that we're reading and thinking and writing about it.
Clearly, right. They're very complicated. People are complicated.
That's
all right, we will continue next week with this and just move straight forward. Straightforward. Very good. Thank you all. Looking forward. Any questions you want to send me my email is dc@pisha.org.
Thank you.
Okay then.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And our next class is with Rabbi Silber this coming Tuesday at 8 p.m. on prayer. And if you are interested If you are interested, you can catch up on the recordings on drisha.org/live.